My name is Sophia Miller. I am interviewing my grandfather. Would you please state your
Scott
name?
Miller.
Could you please state your age and your generation?
I am 78.
His generation is boomer.
Okay.
Okay, so in your own opinion, what is the biggest issue facing Gen Z today?
Facing who?
Gen Z, my generation.
The biggest challenge facing Gen Z today. Recognizing good government from bad government.
Can you elaborate on that?
Governments tend to be self-grandizing, one-sided. You need to be aware that the government needs to have a balanced approach with regard to domestic items. Needs to be fair and just.
Okay, I like that. So, when you were growing up in your generation, what was the biggest issue that you saw growing up?
Vietnam War.
Good point. So, growing up in that time frame, was there a big divide between each individual generation, or was there an understanding of each other?
There was a big divide.
A big divide? Like how it is now, or was it different?
It was different. During the war, during the war and my generation, there was a rift in my generation. Mm-hmm. There were those that were not necessarily for the war, but were going into the military, and those that were steadfast against the war and not going into the military under any condition. Mm-hmm. And that caused a big problem. So then after that, we saw a lot of returning veterans going back to college and noticing that the younger kids in college didn't really appreciate what they had, and that caused a few problems. So all in all, it wasn't all that bad, but there was some differentiation between the generations.
Okay. So when you were growing up, there wasn't technology like it was now, right?
No.
Growing up with children and the technology that was being advanced during that time, do you think that it caused a different viewpoint for each generation because they grew up differently with a new generation of technology?
No, as far as technology is concerned, no, I don't think so.
What do you think causes the biggest rift between each generation today?
Lack of understanding.
Do you think it's more of respect or more of that Gen Z is more argumentative than other generations?
No, I think it's just one generation doesn't really understand where the other generation wants to go or what they're doing. You can't, how do I want to say it, verbalize to each other where your priorities lie and why. So that's a problem. That's a problem for every generation. Lack of communication, lack of serious communication and understanding.
Okay. So growing up, I'm going to go back to your childhood. Was there a really kind of growing up with like your parents' generation, they were a whole different kind of viewpoint because they grew up in the technically 19th century. They grew up in the 1800s.
1900s. My parents were born in the 1900s. 1921, 1923.
I'm thinking of your grandparents.
My grandparents, yeah, were born earlier.
Yes. So, growing up with them like that, was there kind of understanding, like when your kids were growing up, was there ever a time when they said, you don't understand what I'm going through?
Oh, every day.
And then growing up with your parents, do you think they kind of had that same kind of viewpoint of, I do understand what it's like, even though it was kind of a different time?
I don't think so. When I was growing up, there was no internet, there was no phones, so my parents would just tell us what to do, and for the most part, we just did it, and that was the end of it. Everybody, at least when I was growing up, most young people did what their parents told them to do, and they still do today. The difference today from back then is all the technology, all the internet, all the telephones. It's something that we didn't have access to. So, no, my parents they didn't like our music.
Do you think because the generation now is growing up with like phones, everything like that, and you didn't, do you think there is like a harder time for you growing up because you didn't have
No,
the
it was much easier.
Much easier?
Much easier.
Why do you think it was much easier?
Because there wasn't all the drama with all the internet and all the telephone stuff and Instagram and this and the other. It's just too much baloney.
Okay, I agree with that. So, how would, let's say, if like you went out with your friends and your parents wanted you to kind of check in throughout the night, like some parents now do, how would you do that? Because you didn't have that accessibility of the phones.
I really wasn't required to check in. I was required to be home at a certain time.
Okay.
And if I wasn't, then there were consequences. And the same for my friends. If they were told to be home at a certain time, no matter when I was told to be home, if we were all together, they went home.
Yeah.
Or there was consequences. And the consequences usually were you weren't going to be going out for a long time.
So growing up in that time era, do you think your viewpoint of the biggest issue facing Gen Z, if you were growing up in the same era as your parents, do you think they would have the same opinion of government that you have against Gen Z to your generation?
Well, I think everybody ought to be paying attention to what the government's doing. My parents paid attention to what the government was doing because they had just come out of the Second World War in Korea. And the Second World War was widely accepted as a good, quote unquote, a good war. Korea was not accepted as a very good war, and Vietnam was not accepted at all. So as time progressed, the wars became much more politically motivated rather than in defense of your country.
Yeah.
So, no, I think everybody needs to pay attention to what's going on in the world, in their life, in their country.
Do you think discussing government is kind of a taboo now, to where if you discuss it, there's just going to be multiple different arguments about it?
That's okay to have different arguments about it. In fact, that's probably good to have different opinions and viewpoints. But don't take it to the extreme that you can't talk to each other anymore.
Do you think it's become an issue that people now, if you discuss politics within relationships and families, it can tear apart that family?
Absolutely.
You think that's a big issue?
I think that's a big issue.
How do you think, as a whole, what do you think would be the biggest solution to that?
Communication. You have to have open communication. You have to understand the other person's point of view. You don't have to accept it, but you have to understand it. And the first thing you should not ever do is be accusatory or go into a defensive kind of a posture. Just discuss it. You have your opinion, they have their opinion. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not.
So if you met someone from my generation and they had a completely different viewpoint on, let's say, the Vietnam War, a war that you grew up with, right? If they had a completely different viewpoint and they were saying the opposite of what you thought of it, what would you respond with? Would you be more direct in having a conversation with them, or would you be more argumentative with them and saying, well, you don't understand because you didn't grow up with it?
No, I would talk to them about it. It's so controversial. So yeah, everybody has a different point of view, and that's fine. It ought to be that way.
Yeah. Do you think if everyone had the same point of view,
And we're in trouble.
do you think it would be more of a kind of broken world when we all have the same point of view instead of being different?
Yes, absolutely.
So your viewpoint of it would be talking to them instead of just arguing with them, right?
Yeah, talk, educate yourself on the issues, know what's going on, determine what's important to you, and be able to justify it.
So with your generation and my generation, do you think if there were to be a big group of, let's say, individuals who are your age, individuals who are my age, if we were to all have a discussion about something and we would all disagree on a certain topic, do you think most of your generation would agree with you in saying just discuss it instead of being argumentative? Or do you think some of them would also be
I wouldn't
argumentative?
speak for everybody, but I think if you put two large groups of people together with divergent opinions, you're going to have some people that become upset. You're going to have some people that are not ever going to accept another person's point of view. But for the most part, I think people would go down the center of the road, talk to each other, and not go to the extreme left or the extreme right.
So I've talked to some different people that are in my generation about what they think is such the divide between different generations, and most of their responses are all the same, of the fact that older generations don't understand the struggles of our generation. So from your viewpoint of it, what do you think are the struggles for Gen Z other than understanding government?
I think Gen Z is going to have economic struggles. I don't see our government spending uncontrollably, and there not be repercussions down the line. There probably won't be repercussions for me. There's going to be repercussions for somebody.
Yeah.
That's what I think is going to be the biggest issue going forward.
Okay. Thank you for your time. I think that's a good place to leave it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.